it. And we say the later the stage, the quicker you are aware when you have what we call fallback. Behaving in ways you don't actually want to behave, but you're aware of it. And later can always more readily, not always, more readily coach earlier stages. Having it without using it, even just having it internally, the question, where might this person actually have their center of gravity? Where do they tend to move out of? What are their vulnerabilities specific to stage? If you know that, then whatever else you do is probably more effective.
So I'd love to just get started and start talking about your ego development model. And what I'd love to do is just get your perspective on like the behaviors, beliefs, emotions, thoughts, and sort of identifiable characteristics of people in each of the stages so that my community of coaches and counselors and therapists, etc., have an easier time identifying where a person is and then giving them the right psychological exercises and strategies to help them progress. So
now you know how difficult it is to actually assess a person, because there's no person who doesn't have a range of responses depending on the context, on the day of time. It really so it's hard to just, what I find difficult with things like spiral dynamics is they take one behavioral thing they see and then stage the person, and that to me is fundamentally wrong, or ill-advised. I shouldn't say wrong. Somebody might be very good and still do well, but in general that. And now we have an AI scoring system, so I suppose you could recommend or have a group that does it through AI. I rely on, I really worked hard on with the people who created it, and I think it's reliable.
that is fascinating. I will definitely want to get more information on that when we're done chatting. But I also think it's so important that you said that this is not like people are not in one stage, and identifying what stage someone's in is not easy, because that's what I've been trying to communicate to my audience as well. And you're the expert, so I like you saying it.
Yes, and it depends on who you already are developmentally. Generally, we say you can't really coach somebody well who is later than you are, because you simply don't understand their way they make sense. And later can always more readily, not always, more readily coach earlier stages.
That makes complete sense. So then most of the coaches in my community will be able to coach somebody at the self-centric stage, or the sort of orangey reddish stage in your model. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that is, what you know about
That is
stage?
actually, those very early ones are the hardest to coach.
Yeah.
Because they're not yet open to even the idea of coaches. They don't seek out coaches. They don't take well to any kind of advice from somewhere else. That is just so if they have clients at those early stages, I almost would think for the very earliest one, you have to do behavior management. You have to be tough. You have to be, and that's often against the nature of those who are in the helping professions. They don't like to just say you do this or else. And that's exactly what the very early stages need. We see that now in our politics. Nobody says no for multiple reasons, self-serving ones as well. But to be able to say, up to here, you do something that's not okay. So unless you do this or that, there's going to be consequences. Real behavior management.
So like similar to techniques we might use with younger children, where it's like, don't run across the street without holding my hand kind of stuff. Yeah, that makes
or even tougher, sense. Yes. And if it's adults.
Yeah.
And that's the early stage that I would say are unsocialized and uncivilized.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't gone through even the basics of the sandbox,
Mm-hmm.
sharing a bucket, or a shovel. They don't. They're only out to look out for themselves. And we
Okay.
call this stage quite often self-protective, because when you look underneath, there is really be tough in a world that is basically like a jungle. Unless you get the upper hand, you lose. It's
Mm-hmm.
lose, win, lose. And of course, that's hard to be in. And it tends to be that men tend more to be the macho, this kind of, and women hide. So
Mm-hmm.
we know very little about women at this stage because they're not seen. In order to protect themselves, they hide. They try to be under the radar, to not enrage or whatever their partners or the men in their lives.
So it sounds like potentially people who are working in maybe prisons or rape crisis centers or like spousal abuse sort of communities might encounter somebody in this stage.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. And be particularly sensitive whether it's a person. There are women who can be aggressive too, of course, but to notice those who hide, because they're probably need the most support.
Yeah, for sure.
And the other ones are pretty, I find them very, very hard to deal with.
Okay, well, I think most of the coaches I'm working with now are not working in those communities. So let's talk a little bit about the group-centric stage, which in this model, which I'll put up on the screen when we show this video, is orange. So what would a group-centric?
It just means we call it stage 3 or group centric.
Okay.
That's the next one, and that's the first socialized stage, where people have learned to realize I'm actually more stronger if I'm with a group than me against the whole world. But they don't have yet, in some ways, a separate self-identity. Their identity is the group they belong to. They make sense through that filter. And again, it's because it's still early, it is very strong. And then you have all in any religion, you can have people at this stage. You can also have people at much later stages, but this is when you just follow word by word what the Bible says. That's the truth. Or the leader, what he says or she says, that's the absolute truth. There is no questioning. There is no saying, that doesn't, you just do what you're being told. And again, you can notice this when somebody at this stage, sometimes because they tend to describe others in black and white terms, they may say, all white people are such and such. I never do this or that. And that's sort of a tiny hook that you can step, really? Never? Can you think of a time when you actually did that? Say, did what that's the kind of coaching skills. But there's very relatively little you can do with people at these early stages, other than another trick is to show them somebody else who behaves like they do. So it's not personal, so they don't feel judged so much. Sometimes we do that. We show a little movie or a clip of somebody who behaves like a group-centric person, and then ask the person we're actually trying to coach, so what do you observe? How does that work for that other person?
That's a great tip and
Get
technique.
some distance, because it's still very hard if you critique. It's the whole person. It's not a piece of my behavior. It's all of me. I'm no good. The extremes of being vulnerable. Or
What
you attack my leader. Good grief. I will respond very strongly.
Yeah. So what kind of communities do you think you'd find these people in? Like I'm imagining if maybe if some coaches in my community work in church settings or other types of tight-knit communities
Well,
might
the
they find?
military certainly
Military.
attracts adolescents or young men who are really looking for that structure, for that, law, and then they follow the leader kind of things. Yes, you find that certainly.
Yeah.
And in the religious communities, you can find anything from very early to very late, all belonging to the same religious community. That's again, it's a spread. Only that the sort of early conventional attracts people at the group-centric level, because there they find the holding environment that they basically need and desire.
So let's then talk about the skill-centric stage. Is this when coaches might start encountering more of these
Yes,
folks?
because in our data of 11,000 now, at least 30% of adults are at this stage, and another 40 or so are at the next stage. And very few are really post-conventional. So yes, you will. And because it's a stage that it's where we sort of say the self emerges, the separate self, then you, of course, say, I'm no longer that. You turn back and you reject what came before. And it takes usually a while before you, if you even can, integrate that. But it's a oppositional stage, making sure you see me, making sure I'm heard, making sure my opinion gets listened to. And very little questioning. If you question me, you question my whole self, not just whatever you criticized. That distinction is not yet there. The self is not strong enough to have that sense that some of it, of course, I'm having flaws and you can criticize me for it. But as a whole, I feel whole. That is not there yet.
And so some of their behaviors, it sounds like they would be reactive to criticism.
Reactive, argumentative, or again, if they're on the other side, they may be self-conscious. They're very thin-skinned. The smallest thing you criticize is a big deal, rather than just, oh, okay, sure. That and perfectionism. To be so good at something that it really gives you all the self-esteem you want is I'm the best, I'm the expert. Don't you question me. And a very hard time, usually single contributor, very good, they could be high level, but single contributor, and if you ask them, for instance, because they're overwhelmed with work, you could delegate. They might try, but very quickly, if the other person does it a little differently than they would, they take the assignment back because they're the only one who can really do it correctly. And so learning to delegate is one of the skills that you try to teach at this level. The other one is prioritizing, seeing what is actually important, not just everything is calling for my attention. That is another skill that comes on board naturally at the next level, but not here yet.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So then, as you're working with somebody in the skill-centric stage, in like a coaching context, you would be teaching them, it sounds like kind of like the traditional, I'd say, capitalist productivity, 80/20
Absolutely.
rule, like
Yes, because
prioritization, all that stuff.
and sell it in terms of better job opportunities, because in general organizations kind of expect you to be able at the self-authoring stage. So if you're not yet, you run into issues. You're not very good at collaborating, again, because that requires one set more capacity than you have at this level. And I find it a very hard stage to coach.
I think many of the people that my coaches are coaching are in this stage, so God bless them.
God bless them. And one other thing you have to do, if you're not part of the same expertise, then you have to, before you do anything else, you actually have to stand up and announce your expertise in doing coaching or whatever it is, so that you're heard, because otherwise you just don't even count. You know nothing about my field. You know nothing about this technology. Who do you think you are to coach me? So in some ways, establishing your expertise and selling it in terms it will help you get ahead is what you have to do. And that feels a bit, again, for many people, that's not easy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's super useful. So then another group of people that seem to seek a lot of coaching is this self-determining, self-authoring, I think is what you also said,
Yes.
stage.
And
Go ahead.
that's the most common stage and the most valued by society.
Mm-hmm.
You get the most rewards, you get the most exposure. It's where our whole systems try to get the citizenry to be at that stage.
Mm-hmm.
Our jurisprudence, our educational systems, they all want you to become self-authoring.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, 60% of Americans do not have a higher education than sixth grade. Now imagine how much capacity for independent thinking is there. It just has never been developed.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a real concern if we can't run democracies, if people can't make independent judgments.
Mm-hmm. And are they making independent judgments at this stage? Is this
People
the
who are at
first
that
time they
stage,
do that?
yes, where
Okay.
they can, and not just follow opinions or who is your best resource. You know, your professor so and so says this and that, so therefore it is like that. That's the truth. No questioning yet at the previous stage at the 3-4. Now that there's a big shift between 3-4 and 4 when you now can actually start to be more scientific, more objective, more even at yourself. You say, oh, why interesting. I tend to do these things. I see patterns in my own behavior and the behavior of others. Before that's not yet on the radar.
What does that look like? So, like in your paper, you talk later on about systems thinking. What does it mean at this stage to identify a pattern? Is that like
It's
smaller?
still it's external.
It's external.
There are people that sometimes gets into trouble. People who are systems analysts, for instance, thinks they're already at the post convention. They're not. They're doing the practice of system thinking. That's a skill. And apply it to the external systems, organizations, whatever they're looking at. But it's not internalized. They don't use it for their own inner world. To see yourself as a system, that is where the shift is.
Very important point that helps make it super clear because this particular stage, I try to identify when people are at this stage, and I can't, other than like participating in what society wants us to do, I have a difficult time finding pieces. Are there other pieces that you're like, oh, like that might mean, and again, a person isn't at one stage, but that might mean they're thinking about this situation in this way.
Well, listen, can they see the bigger picture? Even if it's externally, can they connect dots that from different places that before they couldn't? Can they actually, if you ask them, can they give you a good reason? And then you ask, could there be another reason? And they can actually come up with one.
And they are able to do that at this stage.
Yes.
Okay.
And some
Okay.
of the most advanced, when you think of I think of psychotherapy. Have you ever seen the Gloria tapes?
No.
Well, I recommend you look at them because all three therapists, Rogers, Pearls, and I forget the third one, treat the same client. Her name is Gloria. That's why they're called Gloria tapes. And when you listen, you realize they all expect her to be self-authoring. They can't imagine that she's not yet there. And so their interventions are in some ways missing the point. They miss her. Still it's fascinating. But so that you can be very sophisticated in any field and operate from this level.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason I got so interested in your work is because I saw a little bit of what you've been studying your whole life. And I was like, wait a minute, like these psychological exercises aren't going to work for people if they see the world in this particular way.
Yes.
And I was like, oh my God, mind blowing. Because
it is, and but you can also always trust in other things. Stage is not everything. It's just one small aspect of being a human being. So
totally. And like
so
my psychology world, I still like love all the pieces. I just think this is a nice. So like I'm currently teaching a group of coaches and they of course have all of their other models and this is just one more model to add on top to use with CBT and to use with ACT so that they can approach things in different ways when they get stuck. So,
it is a good having it without using it, even just having it internally. The
yep.
question, where might this person actually have their center of gravity? Where do they tend to move out of? What are their vulnerabilities specific to stage? If you know that, then whatever else you do is probably more effective.
I totally agree. So let's talk about what seems to me like a pretty big transition between self-determining and self-questioning.
Absolutely. That's
Like
one of
before we
the,
talk about self-questioning, what's that transition like? Like it seems to like shake
oh,
people.
people often encounter it midlife.
Hmm.
They've done all the child rearing and their professional advancement and success. And then they say, isn't there anything else to it? I'm tired of it. I don't want to, and
Yeah.
they start questioning. That's one place that tends to then, but they also then tend to want to know. And they may reach out to a coach or go
Hmm.
to a course. Before that's less the case. But here, yes.
Hmm.
And just the sense that because of the stage 4, there's so much distinguish between this and that, me and not me, all the object and subject differentiation. You start to think, well, maybe I don't even know who I really am. Because I notice when I'm with my family, I'm kind of the boss. And when I'm at work, I'm a collaborator. And in some situation, when I'm in my sports center, I'm a real. And you say, "Hey, who am I really?
Hmm.
Is there a person inside that's me?
Hmm.
Who am I?" That question also often helps people move
Hmm.
out of self-authoring into questioning, self-questioning.
Hmm. That's great. And there are so many psychological exercises that help people like look at who am I?
Yes.
And I just think those are so perfect for this transition.
And you take more than one perspective.
Yeah.
Because even if are you usually with groups?
Yes.
Well, then there's excellent exercises to really, even just physically, if you sit and somebody else sits over there, they have a different perspective on what's happening. As is, we have eyes and we look in a direction. So
Yeah.
to really bring home the multiple perspectives.
Yeah, I think that perspective piece is key. If I had to guess my own experience in this transition, it was
Mhm.
realizing that my husband's perspective was also real and my perspective was real simultaneously. And I'm like, what?
And that is both beautiful and opening it, and all the DEI stuff has to do with
Yep.
that recognition.
Yeah.
And of course, it can also, like any other stage, it can trap you because then you can actually not take a stand. If you
Hmm.
truly believe that everybody else's opinion and perspective is equally valid, who is going to make a decision?
Mm-hmm.
then you get what in organizational terms is called decision paralysis. Beautiful meetings that go on for hours. Everybody feels good about, and everybody speaks, but there are no decisions. Because it would be against the nature of that stage to take on a stand and say no.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also the stage that has the most difficulty with teaching very early stages. I mentioned it
Mm-hmm.
before because it's so against the natural appreciation of diversity
Mm-hmm.
and the sense of if you're not doing that, you're not yourself. Something is wrong.
That's fascinating. So if I have coaches who are in this stage, they might feel that conflict about working with people in the earlier stages. That's a good
Yes.
insight for them to know about themselves.
How tough it is
Yeah.
when you identify with the goodness and the diversity and respecting others to actually be tough.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the next stage. This stage is still, it's so fascinating to me. Every stage up to this stage thinks, if only everybody else were like me, then the world would be a better place. It
That's a good
takes the
clue.
shift to the next stage to say, interesting. I actually have gone through all these stages.
So let's talk about that next shift then before we get into the stage. Is that another big um like shift? Because I don't personally have I don't know what that shift is.
It is a major shift and has to do with the capacity to, again, prioritize. Not every opinion is as
Mm-hmm.
equally valid. To come to that point, to say that, yes, I'm listening to the major stakeholders, let's say, but I'm not listening to everybody. I seek out
Mm-hmm.
whose opinion I want to think might be different from mine, not the same, different and informative,
Mm-hmm.
and then make a decision.
Mm-hmm.
For now, we're going to do it this way. We have 6 months, whatever the time is. It's not forever. It's just let's move this way for now and see how experimenting do and see what happens.
So you marked basically prior to this, are you generally seeking out opinions similar to yours? And then moving into self-actualizing, you're like, oh, I actually want to seek out opinions different than mine? Because that's
To
really
some degree, yes.
okay.
If everybody was like me, the way I see the world, then things would be much better.
Hmm. And then after that, you don't have that belief as much, or you're just curious about.
You're more curious and you don't have that belief as much. You really do know because you by now you know a lot about human nature, about organizations work, all kinds of expertise. You realize that not everybody really does have expertise. Not everybody's
Mhm.
opinion is equally valued or helpful
Hmm. And
even
what
if
are some tools for figuring that out? So like, um, when we're young, we take the advice of like our parents and elders. And then at some point, you start to realize like, my parents don't know about X, Y, or Z, and maybe you don't listen to them about X, Y, or Z. Is that kind of what you're talking about, where you're like, oh, this
yeah,
person
then
has expertise in this, so I'll listen to them on that.
yes, and you engage people with expertise in areas that you feel you might need some help or support or
Hmm.
sounding board or whatever. Sort of like you do now, right now with me.
Hmm.
Uh, that would be also more natural going to coaching, going to therapy because you realize you have some things in in you that need attention. All of that is really becoming very important at this stage to find yourself. Good word is to say finding yourself, your true central self.
Hmm. And so, if a coach who may not be at this self-actualizing stage gets a client who is at this stage seeking to, improve those aspects of themselves or whatever, or learn about those aspects of themselves, how could somebody who's not there still support them? Because I know a lot of my coaches aren't there and they know that.
most coaches aren't. Again,
Yeah.
look at the distributions. It's not
Yeah,
likely.
statistically speaking, it's unlikely.
Yes. Well, there are other skills,
Hmm.
listening skills. Just inviting somebody to really talk about their dilemmas and their worries and not necessarily giving advice,
Hmm.
but being an excellent listener. And maybe here and there ask questions. Good questioning is a very important part of um, coaching later stages.
Because these people are themselves questioning and kind of like need support with that. Is that?
Well, that and because you may observe something, or they may even share with you some things they don't understand. So just go deeper in exploring that.
Hmm.
Not come with there are of course also exercises and stuff that one can do, but generally it's just good listening.
Hmm.
It's the basic thing about coaching is just listening. Who is this person at the other end of our dialogue? How do they make sense? What do they like? What are they afraid of? All of those curiosities you can bring to the client. What is it like to be in their family or their culture? That to me seems just as important, or to what stage is somebody at?
Hmm.
First, who is this person? How is it like to be them? That, and then if it makes sense, adding developmental ideas or support is also fine, good, but I wouldn't start there ever.
I think that all makes perfect sense, especially in the context of what I imagine is not too many people are in this stage and beyond. And it seems like they may experience like some loneliness or disconnection from other people. Have you seen that?
That is true. Starting stage 5 generally has very high self-esteem. I haven't seen too many who don't,
Hmm.
because they're powerful, because they understand so much,
Hmm.
because they know their own becoming. They know that they have grown through stages, but they often, it's actually a good stage in organizations. It's probably better to be at this stage than any later ones,
Yeah.
because becoming aware that even your own self story is just a story, it's all invented, that is tough.
Yeah.
And people really can suffer when they're in that place. Nobody else understands them, not even their spouses. They don't understand themselves.
Hmm.
After feeling so good about themselves at stage 5, suddenly it all falls apart.
Okay, so then let's talk about construct aware when it all falls apart. Because I think in the way I'm teaching this, I'm talking about well-being and how we improve well-being across the stages. And this stage seems like there's a potentially notable dip in well-being. So, or you said falls apart. Just say what you think it is.
Yes, it's the belief that we can solve problem, the belief that whatever story we tell about ourselves is the truth. Those things fall apart.
Hmm.
But there is also the potential for lightness. So what? So now I'm really free to be myself. I don't have to pretend this or that or the other.
Hmm.
I can be brave, or maybe I'm not, but it depends a bit on what kind. You can be ego aware, which means I'm aware of my internal processes to very delicate fineness and that of other people. I can be construct aware, which is usually a bit more intellectual. I just know that everybody, all theories, they're just stories, they're maps, they're not real.
Hmm.
They're helpful. We need them. We need maps, but they're not the territory. They're not the real thing behind it.
And what do you think leads to that transition between the self-actualizing and the construct aware? Because it seems like maybe, to my mind, one of the biggest differences and jumps. And so, like, how does that even happen?
When life brings you surprises,
Hmm.
you think you understand so much, and then suddenly there is something you just can't make sense of, for instance. So the balance between knowing And mystery is one of the shifts where you realize in the end, we don't know. We can't know. We can try, we can have our maps and we can, meaningfully use them. But in the end, there is no knowing. That shift from the knowing side of things to also accepting mystery and inevitable polarities and polar opposites. To be aware that language does that with us. As soon as we are operating in language, we're caught in that. It's we cannot talk to each other without being caught in it in the discursive mode.
Do you think it often becomes apparent through some sort of insight about language specifically, or maybe ego, or?
To me, it's the personal thing. Obviously, as a certified linguist, yes, that's the first thing I hear, and I'm not a native speaker, so I'm of course sensitized to language differences. It's not necessarily so for people who just speak their own ordinary language. We're not. We're using language as a tool. I say something and you give it to you as a present and you receive it, and that's how we use language. We're not aware what it actually does, how it frames anything we say in a particular way.
I wonder too if it could be like based on area of expertise. So you are the language expert, and like my background's in psychology. So like the ego aware piece and seeing behavior
closer to you, yes. Yes.
So like depending on a person's sort of area of expertise, maybe that could.
Well, that might be that can always be the catalyst, because you're more sensitive in that area, and you start to try to understand, and that could be the way in. But there are many ways in, and many. The other way I sometimes describe it is the earlier the stage, the narrower the playing field, and the later, the more ways of actually being at that stage there are. More differences among people at those stages.
Within all of the stages?
No, it's like a funnel, like the spirals.
Yes.
The higher up, the more variety, the more different ways of inhabiting a stage there is.
That's fascinating. So then there are, by that logic, a lot of different ways one could experience this construct-aware stage.
Yes.
Do you have any other examples? Like, I don't know that if these people are going to show up in coaching, although they might, because it's not easy.
Well, they show up to, again, perhaps because of my expertise in this area, they show up with me.
To you. Yeah, I bet they do.
Come and say, I'm at the end of my wits. I'm not sure am I still sane?
Yeah.
Or am I nuts? Because that's a good question when you have nothing you can rely on. And you're thinking every time you think something, you immediately deconstruct it. That's not a good place to be, unless you can accept that. The solitude, as you said, it's lonely up there. There are not many people you can interact with that where you can truly feel understood. You always feel somewhat like an outsider, and it's just different.
I guess I'm just wondering how a coach could identify whether somebody's in this stage. Because like somebody could say, and like, I feel like I'm going crazy, and that could be in any stage.
That could be anything. It could be psychopathology, could be anything.
Exactly.
I don't think that unless you fairly late yourself, you will.
You're not going to see it.
And there are also so few people that, and they're usually capable of saying it themselves. Hey, what do you think? Does that make sense? Are there any other people who make sense like me? They would be able to say that. They're, free enough in that way.
Yeah, so I feel like the best, a coach could do if they're at an earlier stage is, like you said, like be a good listener, try to help them feel understood, even if you don't understand what they're talking about.
And even saying that, look, I myself do not understand what you're saying, but I'm happy to listen.
Yeah.
I can see that you, for instance, are in pain. I can see that it's difficult. and suggest even go to therapy, go, refer out, uh, take take some new ways. Nowadays it's okay again to take psychopharma stuff. What do you call them? Psychedelics. And that's a piece I haven't said, starting with the stage 4-5. Before, it's really the mind that governs, or the heart, but not both. Starting there, you start to realize the information that we get from the environment comes from many, many more sources, not just from the heart or the mind, It can come from dreams, it can come from our body, which tells us a lot of what's going on. So teaching those kinds of things. And when you focus on your interior, what's going on inside of me, in my feelings, in my thoughts, isn't it crazy how they, tend to go out to lunch. I start with something and then it gets worse and worse and worse. When you start doing that, there are quite often moments of peak moments where you suddenly realize a stillness or something that's so different from what you're used to. And clearly taking meditation or yoga or any of those things can support that experience of something entirely different than what you're used to.
For those peak moments, do you define that as like an experience or an insight, or
can be any of these things? It's just a moment where the ongoing rattling in our brains stops, even if it's for a few seconds. And there's a calm, a non-attachment, the kind of ease that most people yearn for.
Does that seem to happen more in the construct aware stage, or
it depends again a bit on the personality.
Yeah.
It certainly starts with the stage 4-5. It can happen earlier. But what we think happens is also if you stage 3-4 and you have such a peak moment, when you come back, you try to communicate it. Well, how would you communicate it? In the way a stage 3-4 person would. Just the way it goes. But to encourage people to learn something new, for instance, is a good way to even move them from 4 to 4-5.
Okay.
Or what's called beginner's mind. Try something you haven't tried, or try something you used to. What did you like when you were a teenager? Some hobby or something. And then you have to give it up because of adult life. There's no room for that. How about 1 hour a week? Getting back to that, the joy of that, those kinds of things. How can people find the inner resources they already have? They've just forgotten about them, or in the struggle of daily life, we overlook them, but people have them. So I would say coaching in terms of reactivating inner resources that people perhaps already have. Anchors, things they can, even in their mind, quickly say, oh, yes, I remember there I was happy. At that beach, that was really top in my experience of joy. Doing those kinds of things, I think, may not be traditional coaching, I admit, but it in my experience, it supports people. And isn't that what we like to do?
Yeah, I think that's a great tip though too, for like if you're not sure what they're struggling with, helping them to recultivate that. Almost like, yeah, earlier stage development stuff, right? Is that
Not necessarily, just moments in your life where can you remember a time when you were, I don't know when you were really, really happy or content or free of worries. It can be, most people have those. Not everybody, unfortunately. There are people who live in such dire circumstances that is rarely the case. Or a moment of love, even if you're in a war-torn place, there might have been a person who showed you a kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And you remember those things, particularly when they're rare.
Mm-hmm. And so, like, inviting the client to reflect on these and practice them
Yeah. And when they feel stressed, go back there.
and use them in their
Feel
story.
it again. There is relief. There is a little opening. There is something else than the struggle you're right now, the suffering you're right now in.
Mm-hmm. So then transitioning between construct aware and unitive. First, what's the transition like? And then what is the unitive stage like?
I don't even know what the unitive stage is because I don't have enough data.
Right.
What I do have is indications that some people get beyond even the needing to have an identity. At
Mm-hmm.
stage 5, 6, you still wish you had one. You're still looking. You're still trying to understand, to map, to, some of the later stage theories make a terrible effort.
There are a
to
lot of maps.
the integral, the aqua world, for instance, is still a comprehensive map trying to understand what's going on. At some point, you can just say, we can,
Well,
and you can relax.
it seems like in the construct aware, if you deconstruct all concepts, then the maps just fall apart, right?
But you're yearning because your ego is still operating.
So you haven't deconstructed the ego yet.
Yes.
I see.
That's its whole purpose in my theory is to make sense and to be in charge and to not come to a place where it is, I just have no clue.
No, but that's really interesting. So, like, you talk about these two different parts of construct aware, sort of deconstructing constructs and deconstructing the ego. Do you feel like both of those need to happen to get to, I mean, we don't know tons about this unitive stage, but to get beyond construct aware? Or does
I'm
just
not
one of
sure
them?
whether
Okay, fair enough.
my hunch is they influence each other. People just have
Yeah.
different natural preferences as to go one or the other. And again, the experience of transcendent moments
Hmm.
and the big difference that Ken Wilber makes between states and stages.
Hmm.
People can have quite a few really deep states experiences of the unitive state,
Hmm.
not probably yet make meaning from there.
And they can do that from any of the earlier stages, correct?
Yes,
Yeah,
more
fascinating.
likely the later the stage, the more likely, but not that even the baby can have oceanic bliss, as you know,
Hmm.
being nursing at the, and what more is there than bliss?
Yeah. I do think that makes it even more confusing when people are having these unitive states
Mm-hmm.
from an earlier stage. Then it's like, oh man, like how do we determine where we are or where others are? Because it's so flowy.
Then you can they're explaining that there are the difference between stages and states. And the plotting, well, there could also be horrible states, of course. We can have demonic and absolutely horrid states.
Hmm.
That too, not just blissful.
Hmm.
So finding out if somebody has them, which kind, is probably important.
For
They
sure.
may even need therapy. I mean, really, if it's too much. But when they're positive, it's just a way to get something new, something different, and encouraging to try and practice. All meditative paths, yoga, are practices to enhance that capacity.
Yeah. And so the difference between states and stages is that stages are more permanent or permanent?
They're permanent.
Permanent. So it's like
Really
this is how
shift
you're
your
living the
perspective.
world.
That's how I live in the world.
Lovely.
Yes.
I'm going to
And
push you a little more on unitive. So I know you don't have a whole lot of data as a scientist. That's obviously very important to both of us. You're like, I don't have a ton, but you have, more data and research than maybe anyone. So even if you just have to give like examples from the people that you've interviewed, what do you think this is like. And I know in your paper you say it's like you've clumped everything beyond there together. So it's hard to say if there's six, seven, eight, nine,
I don't,
10.
as I say, I can't distinguish. And there are people who claim they can in our field, and
Hmm.
they say they're using sentence completion tests, but they let people write whole paragraphs, whole stories. And to me, that's a cop out. That's not the sentence completion test does not lend itself
Hmm.
to tap into those areas. Simply the fact. I
Fair
didn't
enough.
know that before I started, but I had to learn the hard lesson. There are other methods. There is skin resistance, there's brain studies, there's all sorts of ways where we can get more at what that would be like. But it is not through verbal discourse.
Because verbal discourse stops making sense after that
Automatically
point.
separates you from there.
Hmm. That makes complete sense. And so in your field, is it mostly measured with sentence completion tests beyond
Well,
there?
I'm talking here about one particular one that makes huge claims that both the statistics and the claims are just not valid. But
Okay.
that doesn't prevent people from making a big.
But
Uh,
there is no truth, right? So who knows?
well, again, you can be judicious. There's
Yeah,
certain
levels
basic
of truth.
things when you have data. That's usually a bit better than if you just say it is so.
I totally agree, which is why I'm speaking to you because I have made some claims of my own trying to apply your work to various exercises. Like, for example, I've put growth mindset exercises in the skill-centric category because it seems like that fits.
That's a good fit,
But
yeah.
but I'm guessing just based on your and others' work. So, we all do the best we can.
And so then that is the phase where you as a scientist do experiments.
Yeah.
Perfectly fine to choose an approach and then really see what happens. How
Yeah.
does it land? Where, with whom does it land and with whom it doesn't?
Yep. And every individual is going to be different, like you said, and
Yes.
have these multi-components. So it's certainly not like A/B testing type of science that I was trained to use. So it's like rainbow of options in each
Yes.
individual. And I
And
think
then,
that's really important for people who have watched this far. Again, like we are all a rainbow and we retain each of the earlier stages as we progress through. So it's not
yes.
like we're never selfish again just because we're in whatever stage. Like we are
No, but
everything.
the difference is when I'm selfish now, which of course I also am at times,
Yeah.
I notice, I know it in the heart of my heart. Oh boy, not again. You don't need to stand up this way here in this situation.
I love that. And do you think that's sort of the case for all of our lower stages? We're just more and more aware of them as we go on. Like I notice myself seeking validation. Still do it, but I'm like,
Well,
oh, there I
sure.
go again.
And it's also part of our cultural conditioning
Hmm.
that that we want some. It's natural that we seek some of that
Yeah.
because it is part of being socialized. You have to be validated. You have to be seen and respected as you before you can move on. And so that's with being aware of it. And we say the later the stage, the quicker you are aware when you have what we call fallback, behaving in ways you don't actually want to behave, but you're aware of it.
Hmm.
And then there's, of course, regression when you can't behave like you used to anymore because you simply don't have the insight anymore. The stage is gone. That happens too.
In moving forward, can you explain that a
Well,
little bit more?
fallback is when you behave in ways you don't like and you're aware
Mhm.
of it. Like you just mentioned, or I too, I know which ones are triggers for me. Regression is when you lose the capacity to operate at the level you used to operate.
Oh, so like permanently fall back.
Yes, yes.
Wow. And how does that occur?
Well, old age,
Gotcha.
injury, illness, all kinds of things, drastic life experiences. You suddenly your country is in a war and you have to, and then
You have
you
to
may actually
survive.
lose it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was in an Eckhart Tolle video. He says something about how like when we're triggered, we like fall back. He didn't use those words, but
Yeah,
like
yeah.
and
Of
respond in
course.
more of a like protective way.
Of course. And we're still made up of three brains. The reptilian brain is there and functions very well for all of us.
Yeah. Thanks,
So
brain.
to acknowledge that and strong emotions, we can get hurt. Even though we are at the later stage, it can still hurt what
Yeah.
others might say, or, only again, later stages have more, I would say, resources to recover.
Mhm.
But it's not that it's not happening.
Yeah, I think just to poke in towards the end of construct where beginning of unitive a little bit more. So my mind focuses on a lot of psychological constructs, concepts, and some of the ones that I've deconstructed so thoroughly don't really arise so much anymore. So I think that's like, it's not just like a resource or a coping strategy. It's like the idea of regret doesn't make any sense. So why do I don't have to have regret anymore or guilt? Like, I know
I
it's,
would say regret we can have because
uh-huh.
we do make mistakes, particularly when they hurt other people. That is to me, at least now I'm speaking just about me, that would be
Yeah.
a regret. But guilt, no.
Guilt.
Because guilt, no, I don't feel this. You say I don't feel guilt about things,
Exactly.
but
I think
regret
I think that's like
occasionally.
so it's like that's I guess I just want to touch in a little bit on how like because these are constructs, they
Make no sense.
they make no sense at construct aware stage.
Yes.
And that's like not just like a language semantic thing. It actually has real world
Felt.
implications for our mental health
Yes.
and well-being.
And
Like
it's a felt sense.
felt sense of like there's no reason to
Yes.
have guilt. And that doesn't mean I want to do harm to anyone. That's
No.
absolutely not what that means at all.
Well, guilt to me, I don't know, then now that's just my interpretation, but
Yeah.
guilt to me has an element of choice in it. I
Yeah.
did something that then I have to, feel guilty about.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then that doesn't make too much sense. Why would I?
Yeah. So I think that's like a good end cap for like, yes, well-being can vary across all the different stages and all these different ways, but there is something unique that happens towards the end where some of the ways in which we suffer actually do resolve themselves because they don't
Yes.
make any sense anymore, basically. It's not
Yes.
like some mystical experience like, oh, I'm suddenly in bliss all the time. It's like, no, actually, these experiences that we call pain and suffering just don't.
I have a perspective on them. They're not, yes, what they sound like because the
They're not what
label
they
they
sound
have.
like. Yes.
Yes. Okay,
Well,
very good.
yeah, that's excellent. Do you have any last words? I really appreciate you taking all the time to chat. I didn't realize how long we went. I just have had such a great time chatting with you.
It's fine. I enjoyed it too.